Hi, and welcome back to an installment of Risk Management. We're going to be starting momentarily a new series of topics on causation, picking up where we left off that the main emphasis of risk analysis is to understand causation. Before we get there, though, I want to dispel some of the instinct that many of you undoubtedly have to first start talking about probability, because that's the natural instinct when we talk about risks. Today's going to be a short lecture setting up the question of why might we want to dispel the topic of probability, and then in the next lecture we'll address that more fully why. Let's recall the definition of risk that I've proposed for our class. The probability of a harm known to be caused by a stimulus, or a cause in other words. The first operative word here is obviously probability. Now if we think about that conceptually, why might people be so interested in probability when it comes to risk? To think about this a little bit, let's go back to the 4 examples of risk that I talked about in a previous class and see if we can tease out a little bit of the question of why people are so inclined to start talking about probabilities. A quick concept review is in order. Remember when we first tried to define risks, we asked what the risk was of being trampled by a non-equine horse, and we concluded it was a logical impossibility because non-equine horses don't exist. We also asked what was the likelihood of being trampled by a warp speed horse, and again we concluded that was impossible, not because it's logically impossible, but because it violates a law of nature. In other cases it might be a law of economics. A third instance in which we had a question that possibly could have been a risk question was to ask what was the likelihood that we would be abducted by an alien. Now here I propose that the word risk really wasn't the right word, but rather we should call this an uncertainty because we don't actually know causation. That is, that aliens kidnap human beings. And I suggested it would be nonsensical and silly to put a definition of risk on this, which would include a probability. And this goes back to that Drake equation we talked about all the way back in lecture 1, where we realized that basically it's anyone's guess what the correct probability would be for this. And then in the 4th example we gave back in lecture 1, we talked about trampling by a horse and what's the risk of that. Here, causation is clear. We know horses exist, we know people can be trampled, and we know horses do it. And so therefore this is not just a possibility, but it's a known possibility and therefore a risk, and therefore we should establish a probability of any given particular instances happening. Now, I propose the following to you back on the first lecture and in lectures 2 and 3, which is to understand risk, and therefore later to manage risk, we need to stop thinking about probability. Think first, I suggested, about what is known to be possible. In other words, think first about questions of causation. That was my suggestion to you. But then, in a frequent series of lectures that I give, I bring up, and I have in this class, conjectures by others who say, well, why shouldn't we talk about probability first? Why can't we do that? What doesn't work? So let me give you a couple of examples and set up the question for the future lecture. What's the probability of a logical impossibility happening? Well, I hope if you're thinking about it, like a non-equine horse, you'd say the probability is 0 because it's impossible. Fine. What's the probability of a nomological impossibility happening? That is, an impossibility that breaks the laws of nature, like a warp speed horse? Well, there again, you might say that the probability is 0. Horses don't travel faster than the speed of light. So this isn't a risk either. But it gets a little more complicated, doesn't it, when we talk about an uncertainty happening? For example, an alien visiting us, where we don't have any causal knowledge or even existential knowledge that aliens exist. And here we could ask and answer very differently what the probability might be to attach to that event occurring. Some people would say it's tiny, that this is a small chance this could happen. Maybe your intuition is the opposite. You think there's a big chance this could happen. Could the chance be 0? That is, could the uncertainty of an alien abduction be 0? What would that mean to have an uncertainty have a probability of 0? Let's keep that in mind for a future lecture. Finally, maybe you just want to hedge your bets. And you'd say, I don't know the probability. It's somewhere between 0 and 100%, or in frequency terms, 0 and 1. I don't know it. And in fact, that's exactly what Judge Posner, whom we've talked about in a previous lecture, has said. That there's a useful distinction between risks and uncertainties. The former term, risk, referring to contingencies for which a probability, a definite number, can be attached, and uncertainties, a contingency to which no specific probability can be attached. In other words, Judge Posner is saying the probability of an uncertainty, according to him, is what? Well, it's somewhere, he says, between 0 and 1, but we don't know it. That's what makes something uncertain. Is the judge right? Is that how we should view uncertainty? Is he correct that the probability of all uncertainties should be written out, if we were to describe it mathematically, as somewhere between 0 and 100%, but indeterminate? If it is that case, isn't knowing that something is a risk nothing more of an accurately knowing that thing's true probability? And finally, if that's the case, isn't it silly to talk about knowing causation first, as I'm suggesting we should do? Really, we should be focused on probabilities, if Judge Posner is correct. Well, I want to wrap up today's brief lecture with the following sort of analysis that many people are inclined to do when it comes to issues of risk. I like to call this probabilistic causation. It's a fancy term. It's been described by philosophers, and I've described it in previous publications. But it's something that everybody sort of gets when we walk through it. Here's the logic. First, we say that every risk or uncertainty may carry a positive probability, however small, of being true. That is, both risks and uncertainties may have a probability attached to them that's a positive number. We just may not know it in the case of uncertainties. Seems reasonable at some superficial level. The second element of this is to basically say that that probability, whatever it is attached to a risk or an uncertainty, is determined by the amount of discoverable evidence in support of or in opposition to that possibility's occurrence. In other words, just like a good lawyer, we're always going out and trying to get evidence to prove our case. And so, whenever we're investigating something as a possible risk or an uncertainty, we go and get evidence in support of it, and the more evidence we find, the bigger the probability that it actually occurs. Seems reasonable again. The third element of probabilistic causation is to say, well, if we had to pick out a specific stimulus as the cause of an effect that is a harm, that we're going to pick out the one that is most likely at any given time. In other words, if we have a broken window and there's a ball lying in the garage behind the broken window, it could be that it was a burglar who broke the window. It could be the ball. It could be a bird that flew into the window, or a meteorite that crashed into it. Lots of different things cause broken windows. But what we might say is, given the evidence for a ball lying next to the window with glass around it, that in that given circumstance, the higher probability lies with the ball than any of those other sources, and therefore the risk was the ball breaking the window. And that, in fact, was the likely probability. This is sort of common sense logic, and this is what most of us use to operate when we're functioning on a daily basis, making judgments about what are or aren't risks that we focus on each day. What I want to suggest, however, is that this intuition, although appealing, is incorrect and doesn't work because of mathematical theory itself. And that will be the focus of our next lecture. What I'd like you to do is write down why you think that probabilistic causation works, and give a few examples on the discussion boards of why you use probabilistic causation on a daily basis and how you might use it. I'll see you in the next class, and I'll see you on the discussion boards.